God gave us 5 time references and the sign of the fig tree to help us understand when judgment began with the church in the lead up to the last days of salvation, the rapture, and the end of the world. We begin with the 1,290 days of the abomination of desolation. In Matthew chapter 24, verses 2 through 3, Jesus used the destruction of the temple as a sign of his coming and the end of the world. In verse 15, he characterizes this destruction as the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. And when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Jesus instructs us to read the book of Daniel to understand the abomination of desolation. When we go to Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, we discover that the 1,290 days of the abomination of desolation is a time when the daily sacrifice is taken away. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. The question is, why is the daily sacrifice taken away? According to Daniel chapters 8 and 11, the removal of the daily indicates that the church cast down the truth and forsook God's holy covenant. As we look at the spiritual condition of the church today, we see that it has indeed forsaken God's holy covenant by teaching that we can become saved by our own works, such as accepting Jesus, water baptism, or even speaking in tongues. Now, insofar as the 1,290 days, we know that it is a spiritual period of time which relates to the destruction of the temple in 587 BC. In this regard, when we go from 587 BC to the year 1994, we get 2 times 1,290. God gives us permission in Ezekiel chapter 4 to equate 1 day to a year. And to ensure that we understand the 1,290 days principle, God takes us further back into history in the year 1877 BC, when Israel was first removed from the land and taken into Egypt. And so, if we go from 1877 BC to 587 BC, we get exactly 1,290 years. But shockingly, when we go from 1877 BC to 1994, we get 3 times 1,290. And so we have absolute proof that God is orchestrating time to focus on the year 1994. The next time reference is 2,300 days. In Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, the temple is cleansed after suffering 2,300 days of desolation, wherein Satan, the Antichrist, typified as a little horn, was given rule over the church. But what exactly does God mean by the cleansing of the temple? Well, in Isaiah chapter 53, the word cleansed is translated as justified, in that many were justified when Jesus bore our sin. Additionally, in Daniel chapter 12, verse 3, we learn that the word cleansed is translated as righteousness, referring to those who become saved outside the church, of whom Daniel chapter 12, verse 4 teaches that they will become like the stars in multitude in accordance with God's covenant with Abraham. And during this time of salvation, Daniel 12, verse 4 informs us that knowledge shall be increased, meaning God will help us correct our errors so that we can reestablish his covenant as the gospel goes into the world to save that great multitude beginning in the year 2000 AD. One important aspect of this cleansing is related to Cyrus's command that the captives of Israel leave Babylon to return to Israel to rebuild the temple, reestablish the covenant, and return the vessels that were necessary for the daily sacrifice and their associated feast days, all of which were completed 23 years later when the temple was rebuilt. Could it be that that time was a shadow of this present time of cleansing? And since we began to leave the church, that is Babylon, in the year 2000 AD, will the temple of God's elect be complete 23 years later in 2023 AD? Now we come to the 42 months. In Revelation chapter 11, verse 2, the 42 months is a time when the court of the temple, where sacrifices were offered, is given to the Gentiles. And according to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 20, Gentiles are described as those who worship idols, which represent the sacrifices of devils. Consequently, Hebrews chapter 10, verses 26 through 29 records that there will be no more sacrifice for sin if we sin willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth. And you may recall that during the 2300 days, the church cast down the truth after forsaking God's holy covenant. In this respect, the church has most certainly been given over to Gentiles. And that is precisely why the 42 month is also characterized as a time when Satan makes war with the saints, as we read in Revelation chapter 13. And it is during this war that God's people will be spiritually killed, that is, excommunicated from the church, because they refuse to worship the image of the beast through miracles, which include speaking in tongues, dreams, and visions, wherein Satan comes as an angel of light. Next, we come to the 5 months of torment, when God's elect are protected from Satan as God judges the church. In Revelation chapter 9, verse 4, we read that the true believers are sealed, that is, sealed by the Holy Spirit, so that they will not be hurt while worshiping in the church. On the other hand, the unsaved received the sting of scorpions. The word sting representing the sting of the law, which we experience when we fall into sin, as we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 56. And the consequence of sin is death. And sadly, this death ultimately leads to eternal damnation, which is the second death. But until such time, Revelation chapter 9, verse 5 indicates that the unsaved will be hurt. And to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months. And their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when he striketh the man. Now, what exactly does the word hurt mean? Well, we learned some time ago that the word hurt in Revelation chapter 22, verse 11 is translated as the word unjust. And in this context, the churches are made unjust because they love to make a lie and they practice idolatry and sorcery, which are characteristic of false gospels in today's church. When we go back to Revelation chapter 9, these sins are associated with the works of our own hands and the worship of devils. And so, as we consider those who teach that Jesus died for the sins of every person in the world, and all we have to do is accept him, we know that they have already been hurt and that they received the sting of the law. But wonderfully, in Luke chapter 10, verse 19, God informs us that his elect will not be hurt by these scorpions as they send forth the gospel, indicating that Satan fell from heaven because Michael came to deliver God's people so that they could take the gospel forth during the church age, which is typified as 1,260 days in Revelation chapter 12, where we also read about Michael's victory over Satan. And this brings us to the 1,335 days, when Michael will be sent once again to deliver and rapture God's elect during a period that is typified as 1,335 days. But before we get to Michael in verses 1 through 2, let's go to verse 12 and 13, where we read about the 1,335 days. Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,335 days. But go thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest and stand in thy lot at the end of days. Now the word lot reminds us that Israel received her lots after God destroyed all of her enemies who represent Satan. And this victory led to a great multitude being saved, according to Nehemiah chapter 9 and Joshua chapter 23. And so, when we back up to verses 1 and 2, we see how Michael will come to help us garner the same type of victory over Satan. In verse 1 we read, And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, everyone that shall be found written in the book. So here we see that Michael will deliver us during a time of trouble, which is the great tribulation spoken of in Matthew chapter 24. And as we learned previously, this time of deliverance is spoken of in verse 7 as a time times and a half a time. And it was during that time that God scattered the power or the dominion of the holy people to indicate that God will take away the dominion of the spiritual leaders in the church and give it to the true believers so that they can possess the kingdom as they resume their mandate to take the gospel of the kingdom into the world right up to the last day. And according to Daniel chapter 10, this victory over Satan was made possible because Michael came to help us in our fight against the king of Grecia, who represents Satan the Antichrist, who was given rule over the church for 2,300 days, according to Daniel chapter 8. And after Michael defeats Satan and his ministers, his final task of deliverance is to rapture God's elect. According to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, after all of God's elect become saved, the trumpet of the arch messenger Michael will sound to signify that the rapture and the end of the world has begun. At that time, we will receive our lot, that is the new Jerusalem or the new heaven and earth, after this world is destroyed. We conclude our study with the sign of the fig tree. The sign of the fruitless fig tree, that is Israel's rebirth in the year 1948, is used to help us know that summer is nigh, meaning Christ is at the doors. In Jeremiah chapter 8 verse 20, we read that the fig tree will not produce fruit in summer like the church, because she too worshipped graven images, like unto the image of the beast, which indicates that we're trying to become saved by our own works as we worship in churches that feature signs and lying wonders. Now, some time ago, we learned that a period of 46 years between the rebirth of Israel in 1948 is related to God's judgment on the church in 1994. In this respect, the temple was in building for 46 years when Jesus began to cast out the money changers who were buying and selling in the temple. We know that Revelation chapter 13 teaches that buying and selling involves the worship of the image of the beast through false miracles. So this activity agrees with the idea that judgment came on the church in 1994. Lastly, in Luke chapter 13, Jesus warns that the fig tree would be cut down if she did not produce fruit after a time of labor. In Psalm chapter 90, we also read that God will cut down fruitless trees within 70 or 80 years, depending on our labor and strength. But after our job of labor to bring the gospel is finished, we will fly away. That is, Michael has come to rapture God's elect. So the question is, will God complete his judgment on Israel and the church 70 to 80 years after 1994? And is the year 2023 a possibility? Or will the full 80 years be implemented, taking us to 2028?